She saw everyone ignore the Mafia boss's mute son, until she spoke to him through sign language. She watched the small hands move like desperate butterflies against the crystal and gold of Bellecourt's most exclusive restaurant, and realized that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is simply see someone who's been made invisible. Hello, family. Welcome back. Before we begin, I have a small but heartfelt request. Please subscribe. Your support is what keeps these stories alive. Every time you click that button, you're helping us share voices that would otherwise be forgotten and stories that deserve to be heard. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and how this story touched you. The Crimson Rose wasn't the kind of place Seraphina Castellano belonged, and everyone knew it. From the moment she'd stepped through the mahogany doors with their etched glass roses, the maitre d's eyes had swept over her thrift store blazer and scuffed ballet flats with barely concealed disdain. But Dr. Helena Marchetti had insisted on meeting here. Neutral ground, she'd called it, though nothing about this temple to old money and older secrets felt neutral to Sera. She nursed her overpriced wine at a corner table, watching the ballet of power play out around her. Men in $1,000 suits spoke in hushed tones over plates that cost more than her monthly grocery budget. Women dripped in diamonds laughed at jokes that weren't funny, their voices carrying the particular pitch of people who'd learned early that survival meant performance. The air itself seemed thick with unspoken rules and invisible hierarchies. Sera's fingers traced the rim of her glass, her mind elsewhere. 3 months since she'd lost her position at the Bellecourt Institute for the Deaf. 3 months since budget cuts had eliminated her job as a sign language interpreter. Dr. Marchetti claimed she had a unique opportunity for someone with Sera's skills, but opportunities in Bellecourt's elite circles usually came with strings attached. Strings that could strangle you if you weren't careful. That's when she noticed the silence. Not the absence of sound. The Crimson Rose hummed with conversation, clinking crystal, and soft jazz from hidden speakers. This was a different kind of silence, a bubble of deliberate ignorance that seemed to surround one particular table near the restaurant's heart. A small boy sat alone at a table set for 4, his hands moving in fluid, desperate gestures. Even from across the room, Sera recognized the language immediately, the sharp angles of frustration, the rounded pleading of please, the urgent repetition that meant, help me. Her heart clenched as she watched him try to catch the eye of passing waiters, busboys, even other diners. But every single person looked through him as if he were made of glass. The boy couldn't have been more than 9, dressed in clothes that probably cost more than Sera's car. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his posture straight despite his obvious distress. But it was his eyes that broke her heart, ancient eyes in a child's face, eyes that had learned too young that the world could be a place where you screamed in silence and no one heard. What would you do if you saw a child desperately trying to communicate and everyone around them acted like they didn't exist? Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness happen in the most unexpected places. Sera started to rise, then hesitated. Something about the careful way everyone avoided looking at the boys' table sent warning bells through her mind. This wasn't simple ignorance or prejudice against disability. This was fear. The kind of fear that kept people's eyes down and their mouths shut in a city where asking the wrong questions could be hazardous to your health. But the boy's hands moved again, forming the sign for lonely, with such heartbreaking precision that Sera's hesitation crumbled. Across the city, in an office where the windows were bulletproof and the walls held secrets that could topple governments, Dimitri Volkov stared at security footage from the Crimson Rose. His sons sat alone at their usual table, hands moving in the language Dimitri had never bothered to learn. The irony wasn't lost on him. He commanded an empire built on communication, on whispered orders and coded messages, yet he couldn't understand his own child. Sir. Victor, his lieutenant, stood in the doorway with the careful posture of a man who'd learned that sudden movements around Dimitri Volkov could be fatal. The meeting with the Torino family. Postpone it. Dimitri's voice carried the weight of absolute authority. At 42, he'd built the Volkov organization from the ashes of his father's smaller operation, expanding from simple protection rackets to a sophisticated network that touched every corner of Bellecourt's economy. Politicians sought his favor, rivals feared his wrath, and the city's elite paid him the kind of respect that came from knowing exactly what he was capable of. But none of that mattered when he looked at his son. Nikolai had been born perfect in every way except one. The doctors called it selective mutism, though Dimitri suspected it was something deeper. The boy could hear perfectly, understood everything, but had never spoken a word. Not even to his father. Especially not to his father. "The boy needs to eat," Dimitri said, more to himself than to Victor. "He's been sitting there for 20 minutes. Should I send someone?" "No." The word came out sharper than intended. Dimitri had learned the hard way that his presence, his reputation, created a wall around Nikolai that no child should have to live behind. When people saw the Volkov name, they saw power and danger. They never saw a little boy who just wanted someone to understand him. Dimitri's phone buzzed with updates from his various operations. A shipment arriving at the docks, a politician who needed reminding of his obligations, a rival family testing boundaries they shouldn't cross. The Empire demanded constant attention, constant vigilance. But his eyes kept drifting back to the screen showing his son, alone in a room full of people. He'd built this life to give Nikolai everything: security, wealth, power. Instead, he'd given him isolation. The bitter truth was that Dimitri Volkov, who could make grown men tremble with a look, was terrified of his own child. Terrified of the disappointment he saw in those dark eyes, terrified of the silence that stretched between them like an ocean he didn't know how to cross. On the screen, a woman approached Nikolai's table. Dimitri leaned forward, his hand instinctively moving toward the phone to call security. In his world, unexpected approaches meant danger. But something about the woman's careful, respectful posture made him pause. She was nobody he recognized. Mid-20s, brown hair pulled back simply, clothes that marked her as decidedly middle class. Not the kind of person who usually moved in the Crimson Rose's rarefied atmosphere. But as she slid into the booth across from his son, Dimitri saw something that made his breath catch. Nikolai's face lit up like sunrise. The woman's hands were moving, forming shapes that Dimitri couldn't interpret but that his son clearly understood. For the first time in months, Nikolai was smiling, really smiling, not the polite mask he wore for his father's associates. Dimitri Volkov, who had never backed down from a fight, who had stared down federal agents and rival bosses without flinching, found himself holding his breath as he watched a stranger do what he had never been able to do. She was talking to his son. The moment Sera's hands formed the first sign, a simple, "Hello, what's your name?" the entire atmosphere of the Crimson Rose seemed to shift, as if the universe had been holding its breath and finally exhaled. The boy's transformation was instantaneous and devastating. His dark eyes, which had held such careful emptiness moments before, suddenly blazed with a joy so pure it made Sera's chest tighten. His small hands flew into motion, signing so rapidly that she had to gently touch his wrist and signed, slower, please, with a warm smile. "My name is Nikolai," he signed, his movements now deliberate and careful. "But everyone calls me Nico. What's your name? Are you real?" The last question hit Sera like a physical blow. Are you real? What kind of life had this child lived where someone simply acknowledging his existence seemed impossible? "I'm Seraphina," she signed back. "But you can call me Sera. And yes, I'm very real. I'm sorry no one was listening to you." Nico's hands trembled slightly as he signed. "You know my language." "How do you know my language?" "I had a sister who was deaf," Sera replied, her fingers forming the words with practiced grace. "She taught me that everyone deserves to be heard, no matter how they speak." The boy's eyes filled with tears that he quickly wiped away, glancing around the restaurant with a wariness that seemed far too sophisticated for his age. "People don't usually. They pretend they don't see me." "Why?" Sera asked gently, though she was beginning to suspect the answer would be more complicated than she wanted to know. Nico hesitated, his small hands hovering in the air as if the words themselves were dangerous. Finally he signed, "Because of who my father is. Because they're scared." Before Sera could respond, she became aware of the absolute silence that had fallen over their section of the restaurant. The conversations at nearby tables had died, and she could feel eyes on them. Not curious glances, but the kind of intense scrutiny that made her skin crawl. A waiter who had been approaching their table suddenly veered away, his face pale. "Nico," she signed carefully, "what does your father do?" The boy's expression grew guarded, older than his years. "He's important. People do what he says. But he doesn't know how to talk to me, and I don't know how to talk to him." Sera's heart broke a little more. Whatever this family story was, at its center was a father and son who couldn't reach each other across a silence that had nothing to do with hearing and everything to do with fear. "Are you hungry?" she asked, noticing that despite the elaborate place setting, no food had been brought to his table. Nico nodded eagerly, then his face fell. "But they won't take my order. They never do when I'm alone." The casual cruelty of it made Sera's blood boil. She raised her hand to signal a waiter, but the man who had been serving nearby tables suddenly became very interested in polishing already clean glasses. Another server actually turned and walked in the opposite direction. "Excuse me," Sera called out, her voice carrying across the hushed restaurant. The maitre d' approached with obvious reluctance, his face a mask of professional courtesy that didn't quite hide his discomfort. "Is there a problem, miss?" "Yes," Sera said firmly. "This young man would like to order dinner, and your staff seems to be ignoring him." The maitre d's eyes flicked to Nico, then quickly away. "I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding." "The only misunderstanding," Sera interrupted, her voice gaining strength, "is thinking that a child doesn't deserve basic courtesy in your establishment." A ripple of tension moved through the restaurant. Conversation stopped entirely now, and Sera could feel the weight of dozens of stares. But she kept her focus on Nico, whose eyes had grown wide with something that looked like amazement. "No one has ever." He signed, then stopped, his small hands shaking. "What would you like to eat?" Sera asked him, ignoring the maitre d', who stood frozen beside their table. Nico's face lit up again as he signed. "Spaghetti with butter. And chocolate cake. My papa says I can have whatever I want, but—" He gestured helplessly at the empty table. Sera turned back to the maitre d', whose professional mask was beginning to crack. "You heard him. Spaghetti with butter and chocolate cake. And I'll have the same." "Miss, I don't think you understand." "I understand perfectly," Sera said, her voice carrying a steel that surprised even her. "I understand that you're refusing to serve a child because of who his family is. I understand that you're all so afraid that you've forgotten basic human decency." The maitre d' looked around desperately, as if hoping someone would rescue him from this situation. Finally, he nodded stiffly and retreated. Nico stared at Sera with something approaching worship. "You're not afraid," he signed. "Should I be?" she asked, though her heart was beginning to race as the full implications of the situation settled over her. The boy considered this seriously, his young face grave. "Papa says the world is dangerous for people like us. That's why I have to be careful. That's why." He paused, then signed something that made Sera's blood run cold. "That's why people disappear sometimes when they make Papa angry." What would you do if you discovered that your simple act of kindness had just put you in the crosshairs of something much bigger and more dangerous than you ever imagined? Sera felt the restaurant's atmosphere pressing down on her like a physical weight. Every instinct screamed at her to make an excuse, to leave, to pretend this conversation had never happened. But when she looked at Nico, really looked at him, she saw something that made running impossible. Hope. For the first time in what was probably years, this child had hoped that someone might actually see him as more than just the dangerous man's son. "Nico," she signed slowly. "What's your father's name?" The boy's hands moved with careful precision, forming letters that made Sera's world tilt on its axis. Dimitrivolkov. The name hit the restaurant like a dropped bomb. Sera heard someone's sharp intake of breath, the scrape of a chair as someone stood up too quickly, the soft thud of a dropped fork. Even she, who paid little attention to the city's underworld politics, knew that name. Dimitri Volkov. The man they called the Shadow King of Bellacourt. The one whose organization controlled everything from the docks to City Hall, whose word was law in half the city, and whose enemies had a habit of simply vanishing. And she was sitting across from his son, holding a conversation that had just made her the most visible person in a room full of people who had spent years perfecting the art of invisibility. But Nico was still looking at her with those hopeful eyes, still waiting to see if she would be like everyone else, if she would suddenly remember she had somewhere else to be, something else to do, someone else to see. Instead, Sera reached across the table and gently touched his small hand. "It's nice to meet you, Nico Volkov," she signed. "And I'm not going anywhere." The spaghetti arrived in record time, carried by a waiter whose hands shook so badly that the plates rattled against each other. He set them down without making eye contact and disappeared before Sera could thank him. The chocolate cake followed moments later, delivered by a different server who looked like he was attending his own funeral. Nico ate with the careful manners of a child who had been taught proper etiquette, but Sera could see the joy in every bite. When was the last time someone had simply sat with him during a meal? When was the last time he'd been allowed to be just a little boy enjoying cake? "This is the best dinner I've had in forever," he signed between bites, chocolate smudging the corner of his mouth. "Even though it's just spaghetti?" Sera asked, twirling her own pasta around her fork. "It's not about the food," Nico replied with wisdom that seemed far too old for his years. "It's about having someone to eat with." The simple statement hit Sera harder than she expected. She thought about her own empty apartment, the meals eaten standing over the kitchen sink, the silence that had become her constant companion since losing her job. Maybe they weren't so different, she and this little boy from a world she couldn't begin to understand. But even as they shared this moment of normalcy, Sera couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing on the edge of a cliff she couldn't see. Every few minutes, she caught glimpses of people at other tables pulling out phones, typing quick messages, making hushed calls. The news was spreading. Someone was talking to the Volkov boy. Someone was breaking the unspoken rule. "Nico," she signed carefully, "where is your father tonight?" The boy's expression grew guarded again. "Working. He's always working. Victor was supposed to watch me, but I wanted to come here. I like the lights." He gestured to the crystal chandeliers above them. "They're pretty, and it's not so quiet. Does your father know you're here alone?" Nico's hesitation told her everything. "He thinks I'm at home with the nanny. But she fell asleep, and I just wanted to go somewhere where there might be people. Even if they don't talk to me, at least they're there." Sera's heart clenched. This child had snuck out of what was probably a fortress just to sit alone in a restaurant, hoping for human contact. The loneliness in that simple confession was staggering. "Nico, you can't just leave home without telling anyone. Your father must be worried sick." "No, he's not." The boy's hands moved with sharp, bitter precision. "He doesn't worry about me. He worries about the business, about enemies, about money. But not about me. I could disappear and he probably wouldn't notice for days." "That's not true." "It is." Nico's eyes filled with tears. He quickly blinked away. "Do you know what he said the last time we tried to have dinner together? He said I was too complicated, and that he didn't have time for complications." The words hung in the air between them like a physical wound. Sera felt a surge of anger at this Dimitri Volkov, this man who had everything but couldn't see the treasure sitting right in front of him. "Your father is wrong," she signed firmly. "You're not complicated. You're just a little boy who deserves to be loved and understood." Nico stared at her with such intensity that she felt exposed, as if he could see straight through to her soul. "Why are you being nice to me? Don't you know what my family does?" The question she'd been dreading. Sera set down her fork and considered her words carefully. "I know your father has a reputation. I know people are afraid of him. But you're not your father, Nico. You're just you. But what if I become like him when I grow up? What if I can't help it?" The fear in his small hands as he formed those signs broke something inside Sera. This child was terrified of his own future, of becoming something he didn't want to be. "You get to choose who you become," she told him. "Every day, you get to choose kindness over cruelty, love over fear. Your father's choices don't have to be your choices." Before Nico could respond, Sera's phone buzzed. Then buzzed again. And again. She glanced at the screen to see a series of texts from Dr. Marchetti. "Where are you? You were supposed to meet me 20 minutes ago. Sera, answer your phone. I'm at the Crimson Rose. Where are you? Oh my God, Sera. Get away from that table. Now." The last message made Sera's blood run cold. She looked up to see Dr. Marchetti standing near the restaurant's entrance, her face pale with terror. The older woman's eyes locked onto Sera's across the room, and she shook her head frantically, mouthing the word "no" over and over. "I have to go," Sera signed to Nico, her hands suddenly unsteady. The light in the boy's eyes dimmed instantly. "Of course you do. Everyone always has to go. Nico, it's not like that." "It's okay," he signed, but his small shoulders slumped with defeat. "I understand. Thank you for dinner. It was really nice." Sera stood on shaking legs, her mind racing. Dr. Marchetti was gesturing urgently toward the exit, her face a mask of panic. Every rational part of Sera's brain screamed at her to leave, to walk away, to pretend this had never happened. But Nico sat there looking so small and abandoned, his brief moment of happiness already fading back into the careful emptiness she'd first seen in his eyes. "This isn't over," she signed to him, the words coming out before she could stop them. "I'll see you again." Nico's eyes widened with surprise and something that might have been hope. "Promise." Sera hesitated. Promising meant commitment. Promising meant she couldn't just walk away and forget about the lonely little boy who'd touched her heart. Promising meant stepping fully into a world she didn't understand, with consequences she couldn't predict. "Promise," she signed. As she walked toward Dr. Marchetti, Sera could feel the weight of every stare in the restaurant. She'd crossed a line tonight, broken an unspoken rule that everyone else seemed to understand instinctively. But when she glanced back at Nico, who was watching her with those ancient hopeful eyes, she knew she'd do it again. Some promises were worth the risk, even if she had no idea what that risk might cost her. Have you ever made a promise that you knew might change your life forever? Sometimes the most dangerous commitments are the ones we make to protect someone else's heart. Dr. Marchetti grabbed her arm the moment she was within reach, her grip tight enough to bruise. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" she hissed, pulling Sera toward the exit. But Sera's eyes were still on Nico, who sat alone again at his table, his small hands folded in his lap, waiting for a father who might never come. And for the first time in months, Sera felt something other than emptiness in her chest. She felt purpose. Dr. Marchetti didn't speak until they were 3 blocks away from the Crimson Rose, her Mercedes cutting through Bellecourt's late-night traffic with urgent precision. When she finally pulled into an all-night diner parking lot, a place that couldn't have been more different from the restaurant they'd just fled, her hands were still shaking. "Sera, what the hell were you thinking?" The older woman's voice cracked with a mixture of fear and fury. "Do you know who that child is? Do you understand what you've just walked into?" "He's a little boy who was being ignored," Sera said quietly, though her own hands weren't entirely steady. "A little boy who just wanted someone to talk to him. That little boy is Nikolai Volkov. His father owns half this city and has buried the other half." Dr. Marchetti ran her fingers through her silver hair, a gesture Sera had never seen from the usually composed woman. "Sera, people who get involved with the Volkov family don't just disappear, they're disappeared. There's a difference. He's 9 years old, Helena. 9. And he's been sitting alone in that restaurant for who knows how long while grown adults pretended he didn't exist because they're too afraid of his last name to show basic human decency to a child. Because they're smart enough to know that getting noticed by Dimitri Volkov is a death sentence." Dr. Marchetti's voice rose, Then she caught herself, glancing around the empty parking lot. Sera, I've lived in this city for 40 years. I've seen what happens to people who cross the Volkovs, even accidentally. Sera stared out the window at the neon sign of the diner, its pink glow reflecting off the wet pavement. So what was I supposed to do? Just let him sit there? Let him think that no one in the world cares enough to acknowledge his existence? Yes. The word came out like a gunshot. That's exactly what you were supposed to do. That's what everyone does. That's how you stay alive in this city. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Finally, Dr. Marchetti's phone rang. She glanced at the screen and went pale. "Unknown number," she whispered. "They never call from unknown numbers unless—" She answered with a trembling hand. "Hello." Sera couldn't hear the voice on the other end, but she watched Dr. Marchetti's face cycle through fear, confusion, and something that might have been relief. "Yes, she's with me," Dr. Marchetti said carefully. "No, we haven't gone home yet." A pause. "I understand. Yes, we'll wait." She hung up and stared at the phone as if it might explode. "Helena, who was that?" "Someone who works for Dimitri Volkov. They want to meet with you." Sera's stomach dropped. "Meet with me? Why?" "I don't know, and that terrifies me more than if they just threatened to kill us both." Dr. Marchetti's voice was barely above a whisper. "Sera, when the Volkovs want to meet with someone, it's usually the last meeting that person ever has." Before Sera could respond, a black sedan pulled into the parking lot with the quiet efficiency of a predator. The windows were tinted so dark they looked like mirrors, and the car moved with a kind of precision that spoke of professional drivers and serious money. "Oh God," Dr. Marchetti breathed. "They're here." The sedan parked directly in front of them, close enough that escape would be impossible. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the rear door opened, and a man stepped out. He wasn't what Sera had expected. Dimitri Volkov was tall but not imposing, dressed in a simple black coat that probably cost more than most people's cars. His dark hair was touched with silver at the temples, and his face carried the kind of weariness that came from carrying too much weight for too long. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, the same dark, intelligent eyes she'd seen in his son. He approached Dr. Marchetti's car with measured steps, his hands visible and empty. When he reached the driver's side window, he made a small gesture, and Dr. Marchetti lowered it with obvious reluctance. "Dr. Marchetti," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent that spoke of old-world origins. "Thank you for waiting." "Mr. Volkov," she managed, her voice barely steady. His gaze shifted to Sera, and she felt the full weight of his attention like a physical force. "Miss Castellano, I believe you've met my son." It wasn't a question. Sera found her voice, though it came out smaller than she'd intended. "Yes. He's a wonderful boy." Something flickered across Dimitri's face. Surprise, maybe, or pain. "He is. And according to my security team, you're the first person in 3 years to have a conversation with him in public." "Your security team?" "The Crimson Rose has cameras, Miss Castellano, as do most establishments in this city." He paused, studying her face. "I watched you talk to my son. I watched you defend him to the staff. I watched you make him smile." Sera's heart hammered against her ribs. He was being ignored. It wasn't right. "No," Dimitri agreed quietly. "It wasn't, but it was safe. For him, and for everyone else." He glanced at Dr. Marchetti, then back to Sera. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to understand that your answer will determine what happens next." The parking lot felt like it was closing in around them. Sera could hear Dr. Marchetti's rapid breathing, could smell her own fierce sweat, could feel the weight of whatever decision was about to be demanded of her. "What do you want to know? Why did you approach him? What do you want from my family?" The questions hung in the air like a test she didn't know how to pass. Sera thought about lying, about making up some story that would satisfy this dangerous man and let her walk away. But then she remembered Nico's face when she'd first signed to him, the pure joy of a child who'd been seen for the first time in years. "I don't want anything from your family," she said, meeting Dimitri's gaze directly. "I saw a little boy who was trying to communicate and being ignored. I know sign language. It seemed like the right thing to do." The right thing to do. Dimitri repeated the words as if they were foreign to him. "In my experience, Miss Castellano, people who do the right thing around my family usually have ulterior motives." "Well, I don't." "No," he said after a long moment. "I don't think you do. Which presents me with a problem." "What kind of problem?" Dimitri was quiet for so long that Sera began to wonder if he'd changed his mind about talking to her. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that seemed to press down on the entire parking lot. "My son hasn't spoken to anyone, not with his hands, not with his voice, in over 6 months. Tonight, he signed more words than I've seen from him all year. He's been asking my security team when the nice lady is coming back." Dimitri's jaw tightened. "He's asking for you, Miss Castellano. And Nikolai never asks for anything." The implications hit Sera like a physical blow. "Mr. Volkov, I never meant." "I know what you meant. That's the problem." He stepped closer to the car, and Sera could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the pain of a father who'd lost his child to a silence he couldn't bridge. "I have a proposition for you." Dr. Marchetti made a small sound of protest, but Dimitri continued as if he hadn't heard her. "I want to hire you, to spend time with Nikolai, to teach him, to talk with him, to be whatever it is you were to him tonight." "You want to hire me to be your son's friend?" "I want to hire you to be what I can't be," Dimitri said, and for a moment, the dangerous man disappeared, leaving only a father who'd run out of options. "I want to hire you to help me understand my own child." Sera stared at him, her mind reeling. This wasn't what she'd expected. This wasn't a threat or a warning. This was a plea. "And if I say no?" Dimitri's expression hardened slightly. "Then you walk away, and we pretend tonight never happened. But Nikolai goes back to his silence, and I go back to watching my son disappear a little more each day." The choice hung between them like a bridge over an abyss. On one side lay safety, normalcy, the quiet life she'd been trying to rebuild. On the other lay a world she didn't understand, with a man whose reputation preceded him like a shadow, and a little boy who'd looked at her like she'd hung the stars. "I need time to think," Sera said finally. "You have until tomorrow night," Dimitri replied. "Nikolai is expecting you for dinner." "I never said I'd." "You promised him you'd see him again." "In my world, Miss Castellano, promises matter. They're the only currency that has any real value." His eyes met hers one last time. "Don't break his heart. He's had enough of that for one lifetime." With that, Dimitri Volkov walked back to his sedan and disappeared into the night, leaving Sera and Dr. Marchetti sitting in stunned silence. "Sera," Dr. Marchetti whispered finally, "what are you going to do?" Sera stared at the empty space where the sedan had been, her mind spinning with possibilities and consequences. She thought about Nico's smile, about his careful question, "Are you real?" About the way he'd looked when she'd promised to see him again. "I don't know," she said honestly. "But I think I'm about to find out just how much a promise is really worth." Sera didn't sleep that night. She sat in her small apartment, staring at the business card Dimitri had left on Dr. Marchetti's dashboard. Heavy cardstock with nothing but a phone number embossed in silver. No name, no address. Just 10 digits that represented a choice she wasn't sure she was brave enough to make. By morning, she'd made her decision 3 different times, changing her mind with each cup of coffee. But when her phone rang at exactly 9 a.m., she knew before answering that her time for deliberation was over. "Miss Castellano?" The voice was crisp, professional, female. "Mr. Volkov has arranged for a car to pick you up at 2 p.m. The driver will take you to meet Nikolai. I haven't agreed to anything yet, Sera said, though the words felt hollow even to her. Mr. Volkov is confident you'll make the right choice. The car will be a blue sedan. Please be ready. The line went dead before Sera could respond. At 1:58 p.m., she stood at her apartment window watching a blue sedan pull up to the curb. The driver was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a neat bun. Not what Sera had expected from Dimitri Volkov's organization. Miss Castellano, I'm Elena. I work for the Volkov family. The woman's accent was similar to Dimitri's but softer, warmer. Are you ready? Sera grabbed her purse, her hands shaking slightly. As ready as I'll ever be. The drive took them through parts of Bellecourt Sera had never seen. Tree-lined streets with houses that looked more like small palaces, gates that spoke of old money and older secrets. Finally, they turned into a driveway that seemed to stretch for miles, leading to a house that took Sera's breath away. The Volkov estate wasn't the fortress she'd expected. Instead, it was a sprawling Mediterranean-style villa surrounded by gardens that looked like they belonged in a fairy tale. Fountains sparkled in the afternoon sun, and the air smelled of jasmine and roses. It's beautiful, Sera breathed. Elena smiled sadly. Mr. Volkov built it for his wife. She loved gardens. The past tense hung heavy in the air. Nikolai is waiting for you in the library. He's been there since breakfast. The inside of the house was just as stunning as the exterior. High ceilings, warm wood, and artwork that probably belonged in museums. But despite its beauty, there was something hollow about it, as if the house was holding its breath. Elena led her through a maze of corridors to a set of double doors. The library, she said softly. Nikolai spends most of his time here. It's quiet. She opened the doors to reveal a room that made Sera gasp. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves stretched up 2 stories, connected by a spiral staircase that looked like something from a dream. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating thousands of books and creating patterns of light and shadow on the polished floor. And there, curled up in a window seat with a book in his lap, was Nico. He looked up when the doors opened, and his face transformed with the same radiant joy she'd seen the night before. He set his book aside and signed rapidly. You came. You really came. I promised I would, Sera signed back, moving into the room. What are you reading? Nico held up the book, a thick volume about marine biology. About whales. Did you know they sing to each other across thousands of miles of ocean? They have their own language, just like we do. The parallel wasn't lost on Sera. That's beautiful. Do you like whales? I like that they can talk to each other even when they're far apart, Nico signed, his expression growing wistful. Sometimes I pretend I'm a whale, singing songs that someone somewhere might hear. The image of this lonely little boy imagining himself as a whale calling across empty oceans nearly broke Sera's heart. She sat down across from him, noting how he immediately brightened at her proximity. Nico, can I ask you something? He nodded eagerly. Last night, you said your father doesn't know how to talk to you. Has it always been that way? Nico's hand stilled, and for a moment, he looked much older than his 9 years. Not always. When I was little, before Mama died, he used to try. But after... He paused, his small hands trembling slightly. After the accident, everything changed. What accident? Nico glanced toward the library doors, as if checking to make sure they were alone. Then he began to sign, his movements careful and deliberate. I was 6. Mama and I were coming home from my speech therapy appointment. She was trying to help me learn to talk with my voice, even though the doctors said I might never speak out loud. His hands paused, and Sera could see him gathering courage. There was another car. It ran the red light and hit us on Mama's side. Sera's breath caught. Oh, Nico. Mama died right away. The doctors said she didn't suffer. But I was awake the whole time, trapped in the car with her. His young face was eerily calm as he continued. I tried to scream for help, but no sound came out. I tried and tried, but I couldn't make any noise. The paramedics said later that if I had been able to scream, they would have found us faster. Maybe Mama would still be alive. The weight of his confession settled over the library like a shroud. This child had been carrying the guilt of his mother's death for 3 years, believing that his inability to speak had somehow caused her death. Nico, Sera sighed gently, your mother's death wasn't your fault. Not being able to scream didn't kill her. The accident did. But Papa thinks it's my fault, Nico replied, tears finally spilling over. After the funeral, he stopped trying to learn sign language. He stopped looking at me the same way. Sometimes I catch him staring at me, and I can see it in his eyes. He wishes it had been me instead of Mama. I'm sure that's not true. It is. Nico's hands moved with heartbreaking certainty. Elena told me once that Papa used to talk to Mama about having more children, about giving me brothers and sisters. But after the accident, he said he couldn't risk loving anyone else that much. He said love makes you weak, and weak people get the people they care about killed. The pieces of the puzzle began falling into place for Sera. Dimitri hadn't just lost his wife in that accident. He'd lost his ability to connect with his son, convinced that loving Nico would somehow put the boy in danger. And Nico, carrying the impossible weight of survivor's guilt, had retreated into silence, believing he was responsible for destroying his family. Where is your father now? Sera asked. Working. He's always working. Elena says it's because staying busy helps him not think about Mama, but I think it's because he doesn't want to be around me. Nico wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. That's why last night was so special. For a little while, I felt like maybe I wasn't invisible. Maybe I was worth talking to. Before Sera could respond, the library doors opened. Dimitri stood in the doorway, still wearing the same black coat from the night before. His eyes immediately went to his son, taking in the tear-stained cheeks and the way Nico instinctively moved closer to Sera. I didn't mean to interrupt, he said quietly. You're not interrupting, Sera replied, though she could feel the tension radiating from both father and son. Nico was just telling me about his book. Dimitri's gaze shifted to the marine biology text, and something flickered across his face. Your mother loved whales, he said to Nico, his voice carefully neutral. She used to say they were the most beautiful singers in the world. Nico's hands moved hesitantly. I remember. She used to play recordings of whale songs when I couldn't sleep. It was the first direct communication Sera had witnessed between father and son, and the careful distance in both their voices was heartbreaking. They were like two people speaking across a chasm, afraid that getting too close would cause them both to fall. Mr. Volkov, Sera said carefully, could I speak with you privately for a moment? Dimitri nodded, but Nico's hands flew into motion. Are you leaving? Are you going to tell him you can't come back? I'm not going anywhere, Sera assured him. I just need to talk to your father about something. I'll be right back. She followed Dimitri out of the library and into a smaller sitting room. The moment the door closed behind them, she turned to face him. He thinks you blame him for his mother's death. Dimitri went very still. What? He thinks that if he'd been able to scream for help, the paramedics would have found you faster. He thinks his silence killed her, and he thinks you wish it had been him instead. The color drained from Dimitri's face. That's not. I never. He sank into a chair as if his legs had given out. How could he think that? Because you stopped trying to communicate with him after the accident. Because you threw yourself into work instead of grieving with your son. Because a 6-year-old boy needed his father, and instead he got a stranger who couldn't bear to look at him. Dimitri's hands shook as he ran them through his hair. I was trying to protect him. After Katerina died, I realized how dangerous it was to be close to me. My enemies, my business. I thought if I kept my distance, if I didn't let myself love him too much, he'd be safer. Instead, you made him feel like he wasn't worth loving at all. The words hit Dimitri like physical blows. I never meant. God, what have I done? You've made mistakes, Sera said gently. But it's not too late to fix them. That little boy in there is desperate for his father's love. He's been waiting 3 years for you to see him again. Dimitri looked up at her with eyes that held the same pain she'd seen in his son's. I don't know how. I don't know how to reach him anymore. You start by telling him the truth. You tell him that his mother's death wasn't his fault. You tell him that you love him. And you learn to speak his language. Sign language. It's not just about the signs, Mr. Volkov. It's about being willing to meet him where he is instead of expecting him to come to you. Dimitri was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Will you help me? Will you teach me how to talk to my son? Sometimes the bravest thing a parent can do is admit they don't have all the answers. Have you ever had to learn a completely new way to show love to someone who needed it? Sera thought about the choice she was making, about the world she was stepping into, about the broken family she was agreeing to help heal. It wasn't safe, it wasn't simple, and it certainly wasn't what she'd planned for her life. But when she thought about Nico's face when he'd asked if she was real, when she thought about the whale songs and the silence that had stretched between father and son for 3 long years, she knew there was only one answer she could give. Yes, she said. I'll help you both. The next 3 weeks fell into a rhythm that surprised Sera with its gentle normalcy. Every afternoon, Elena would pick her up and drive her to the Volkov estate, where she'd spend hours with Nico in the library, the gardens, or the sunroom that overlooked the fountain. And every evening, Dimitri would join them for what he'd started calling lessons. Though Sera suspected he was learning far more than just sign language. It was during the 4th week that everything began to shift. Watch this, Nico signed excitedly, his small hands moving with practiced precision as he demonstrated a new sign he'd learned. Elena taught me the sign for proud. She said Mama used to sign it when I did something good. Sera's heart clenched. Elena had been quietly filling in the gaps, sharing memories of Katerina that Dimitri seemed unable to voice. That's beautiful, Nico. When do you feel proud? When Papa tries to sign with me, Nico replied without hesitation. His hands are too big and he gets frustrated, but he keeps trying. Yesterday he signed good morning and only made 3 mistakes. From the doorway came a soft chuckle. Dimitri stood there with his sleeves rolled up and his tie loosened, a far cry from the intimidating figure Sera had first met. Over the past weeks, she'd watched him gradually shed the armor of his reputation, at least within these walls. Only 3 mistakes, he signed, his movements still clumsy but determined. I thought I was getting better. Nico's face lit up like sunrise. You are. And you remembered to face me when you sign. Elena says that's very important. Dimitri moved into the room, and Sera noticed how naturally he now positioned himself where Nico could see his hands clearly. It was a small thing, but it represented a fundamental shift in how he approached his son, not as someone to be protected from a distance, but as someone to be engaged with directly. I brought something, Dimitri said, pulling a small wrapped package from his jacket pocket. I hoped you might like it. Nico's eyes widened as he carefully unwrapped the gift. Inside was a small silver pendant in the shape of a whale, its surface etched with intricate details that caught the afternoon light. It was your mother's, Dimitri signed slowly, his hands trembling slightly with the effort. She wore it when she was pregnant with you. She said whales were the perfect symbol for our family because they never stop calling to each other, no matter how far apart they are. Nico stared at the pendant, tears streaming down his face. Then, in a movement that shocked them all, he launched himself into his father's arms. Dimitri caught him instinctively, his own eyes filling with tears as he held his son for the first time in years. Nico's small body shook with sobs, and Dimitri's hands moved awkwardly to stroke his hair. I'm sorry, Dimitri whispered, the words coming out in both voice and sign. I'm so sorry, Nikolai. I should have held you like this every day. I should have told you every day that I love you, that losing your mother was never your fault, that you are the most precious thing in my world. Nico pulled back just enough to sign, his movements shaky but clear. I love you too, Papa. I missed you so much. Sera felt tears streaming down her own face as she watched father and son finally bridge the chasm that had separated them. This was what healing looked like. Messy, imperfect, but absolutely real. I have an idea, she said softly, not wanting to break the moment but sensing an opportunity. What if we plan something special? Just the three of us. Like what? Nico signed, still nestled in his father's arms. Well, Sera said, pretending to think, I happen to know that the Bellecourt Aquarium has a new whale exhibit. They have recordings of whale songs, and you can actually feel the vibrations through special speakers. Nico's eyes went wide. Really? We could hear the whales singing. Dimitri looked uncertain. Nikolai, public places can be complicated for our family. What if we went after hours? Sera suggested. I'm sure the aquarium would be willing to arrange a private visit for the right donation. You mean we could have the whole place to ourselves? Nico signed, practically bouncing with excitement. Dimitri considered this, and Sera could see him weighing his protective instincts against his son's obvious joy. Finally, he nodded. I'll make some calls. 2 days later, they stood in the empty Bellecourt Aquarium as the sun set over the city. The whale exhibit was everything Sera had promised and more. A vast tank with curved walls that made visitors feel like they were underwater, surrounded by the gentle giants that Nico had read so much about. But it was the sound room that truly took their breath away. As the whale songs began to play, the vibrations traveled through the floor and walls, creating an immersive experience that was both haunting and beautiful. Nico stood transfixed, his hands pressed against the vibrating wall, tears streaming down his face. I can feel them, he signed. I can feel their voices. Dimitri moved to stand beside his son, placing his own hands on the wall. Your mother would have loved this, he signed, his movements more confident now after weeks of practice. She's here, Nico replied, his small hands moving with absolute certainty. I can feel her in the songs. She's singing with them. The three of them stood there in the darkened room, surrounded by the ancient songs of creatures who had been calling to each other across vast distances for millions of years. And for the first time since Katerina's death, the Volkov family felt complete. Sera, Nico signed suddenly, turning to face her. Are you going to stay with us forever? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sera looked at this little boy who had become so precious to her, then at Dimitri, whose eyes held a question he seemed afraid to ask. I don't know about forever, she said carefully. But I'm not going anywhere anytime soon. Good, Nico signed with satisfaction. Because Papa needs more practice with his signing, and I need someone to help me understand why grown-ups make everything so complicated. Dimitri laughed, actually laughed, and the sound echoed through the whale room like music. Your son has a point, Sera told him. Grown-ups do make everything complicated. Not everything, Dimitri replied, his eyes meeting hers over Nico's head. Some things are actually very simple. There was something in his gaze that made Sera's heart skip, something that spoke of possibilities she hadn't dared to consider. But before she could analyze it further, Nico was tugging on both their hands. Come on, he signed. I want to show you the dolphins. Elena says they're almost as smart as whales, and they like to play games. As they walked through the empty aquarium, Nico chattering excitedly in sign language while Dimitri struggled to keep up with the conversation, Sera felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the warm, encompassing feeling of belonging to a family. It wasn't her family, she reminded herself. She was an employee, a teacher, a bridge between father and son. But when Dimitri's hand accidentally brushed hers as they walked, when Nico insisted on holding both their hands as they stood before the dolphin tank, when they shared quiet laughter over Dimitri's increasingly creative sign language mistakes, it felt like something much more profound. Thank you, Dimitri said quietly as they prepared to leave, Nico having fallen asleep in his father's arms during the car ride home. For giving me back my son. For teaching me how to love him properly. You always knew how to love him, Sera replied. You just forgot how to show it. And you reminded me. His voice was soft, intimate in the darkness of the car. You've given us both something I thought we'd lost forever. What's that? Hope, he said simply. The hope that broken things can be healed. That families can find their way back to each other. That love is stronger than fear. As Elena drove them through the quiet streets of Bellecourt, Sera found herself thinking about whale songs, about creatures calling to each other across impossible distances, never giving up hope that their voices would be heard. Maybe that's what love really was. The willingness to keep singing, even when you weren't sure anyone was listening. And maybe, just maybe, she'd found her own pod to sing with. Have you ever experienced a moment when everything just felt right, when you realized you'd found exactly where you belonged? Sometimes the most unexpected families are the ones that heal us most completely. But even as warmth filled her chest, a small voice in the back of Sera's mind whispered a warning. In fairy tales, the happiest moments often came right before everything fell apart. She pushed the thought away, focusing instead on the sleeping child in his father's arms and the man who had trusted her with his most precious treasure. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. After all, whales never sang alone. The call came at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday, shattering the peaceful rhythm that had defined Sera's life for the past 2 months. She fumbled for her phone in the darkness, her heart already racing with the kind of dread that only came with middle-of-the-night emergencies. Sera! Elena's voice was tight with panic. You need to come. Now. What's wrong? Is Nico okay? Just come. I'm sending a car. The line went dead, leaving Sera staring at her phone in the darkness. She threw on clothes with shaking hands, her mind racing through possibilities, each one worse than the last. By the time the black sedan arrived, she was pacing her apartment like a caged animal. The drive to the Volkov estate felt endless. Elena sat rigid in the passenger seat, her usual warmth replaced by a tension that made the air in the car feel electric. When Sera tried to ask questions, the older woman just shook her head. Wait until we get there. Mr. Volkov will explain everything. The estate, usually welcoming with its warm lights and manicured gardens, looked different in the pre-dawn darkness. Security guards stood at positions Sera had never noticed before, their faces grim and alert. The house itself seemed to crouch against the sky like a fortress under siege. Elena led her through corridors that felt unfamiliar in their urgency, past rooms where men in dark suits spoke in hushed, urgent tones. Finally, they reached Dimitri's study, a room Sera had never been invited into before. Dimitri stood behind his desk, still wearing the clothes from the previous evening, his hair disheveled and his face etched with a kind of fury Sera had never seen from him. When he looked up at her entrance, his eyes held a coldness that made her blood freeze. Sit down, he said, his voice carrying none of the warmth she'd grown accustomed to over the past weeks. Dimitri, what's happening? Where's Nico? Nikolai is safe. He's sleeping, and he doesn't know anything about this yet. Dimitri moved around the desk, and Sera noticed for the first time that his knuckles were bruised, his shirt torn at the collar. But he will know soon enough. They all will. Who will know what? Instead of answering, Dimitri threw a manila folder onto the coffee table in front of her. Photographs spilled out, surveillance photos of her apartment, her old workplace, her meeting with Dr. Marchetti. And there, in stark black and white, photos of her with Nico at the aquarium, in the gardens, in the library. Explain this, Dimitri said, his voice deadly quiet. Sera stared at the photos, confusion mixing with growing dread. I don't understand. These are just pictures of us. Look at the timestamps. She looked closer and felt her world tilt. The photos were dated from before she'd ever met Nico. Some were from weeks before that night at the Crimson Rose. That's impossible, she whispered. I never saw Nico before that night. I never. The photographer was very thorough, Dimitri continued, his voice growing colder with each word. He documented your entire routine. Your job loss, your financial difficulties, your sister's death. Very convenient background for someone looking to infiltrate my family. Infiltrate? Dimitri, what are you talking about? He pulled out another photograph, this one showing Sera in conversation with a man she didn't recognize outside a coffee shop. Do you know who this is? Sera studied the photo, her heart hammering. I've never seen him before in my life. His name is Marcus Torino. He works for my biggest rival in this city. The same rival who's been trying to find a way to get close to my family for years. Dimitri's voice was like ice. The same rival who put a bounty on information about my son's routines, his vulnerabilities, his emotional state. The room spun around Sera. You think I'm working for your enemies? You think I've been spying on Nico? I think you're very good at your job, Dimitri replied. The lost, compassionate woman with the tragic backstory. The sign language skills that made you indispensable. The way you wormed your way into my son's heart, into my home, into my... He stopped himself, his jaw clenching. Into your what? Sera stood up, anger beginning to override her shock. Into your life. Into your family. Is that what this is about? You're angry because you started to care about me. I'm angry because I trusted you. The words exploded out of him with a violence that made Sera step back. I let you into my home. I let you near my son. I let myself believe that someone could actually care about us without wanting something in return. I do care about you. I care about both of you more than I've ever cared about anything. Enough. Dimitri slammed his hand on the desk, and Sera saw the man who had built an empire on fear and respect. I know what you are. I know who sent you. The only question now is whether you're going to tell me what they wanted to know, or if I'm going to have to find out another way. The threat hung in the air between them like a blade. Sera stared at this man who had become so important to her, this man who was now looking at her like she was his enemy, and felt something break inside her chest. You want to know what they wanted to know, she said, her voice shaking with hurt and fury. They wanted to know if the great Dimitri Volkov had any weaknesses. If there was any way to hurt the man who hurt so many others. Dimitri went very still. And I would have told them that yes, you do have a weakness. You have a little boy who loves you more than life itself, who's been waiting 3 years for his father to love him back. You have a son who lights up every time you walk into a room, who practices signing your name when he thinks no one is watching, who asks me every day if I think you're proud of him. Tears were streaming down her face now, but she didn't care. I would have told them that your weakness is that you love that little boy so much it terrifies you. That you'd burn down the world to keep him safe. That you're so afraid of losing him the way you lost his mother that you almost lost him anyway. Stop, Dimitri said, but his voice had lost some of its edge. No, I won't stop. Because you want to know what I learned in these past 2 months? I learned that Dimitri Volkov, the man everyone fears, is actually just a father who's been drowning in grief and guilt for 3 years. I learned that underneath all that armor, you're just a man who wants to be worthy of his son's love. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, her voice growing stronger. So yes, I found your weakness. But I would never, ever use it against you. Because somewhere along the way, your weakness became mine too. The silence that followed was deafening. Dimitri stared at her with an expression she couldn't read, while Elena stood frozen by the door, tears streaming down her own face. Finally, Dimitri spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. The photos don't lie, Seraphina. Someone has been watching you, documenting your life, planning this approach. If you're not working with them, then they're using you. Either way, you're a threat to my family. So what are you saying? I'm saying this ends now. Tonight. You leave this house, and you never come back. You never contact Nikolai. You never try to see him, you never. Papa! The small voice from the doorway made them all freeze. Nico stood there in his pajamas, his dark hair tousled from sleep, his eyes wide with confusion and growing fear. "What's happening?" he signed, his small hands trembling. "Why is everyone crying? Why does Sera look scared?" Dimitri's face went white. "Nikolai, go back to bed. This doesn't concern you." "It does concern me." Nico's hands moved with desperate urgency. "Sera is my friend. She's part of our family. Why are you being mean to her?" "She's not part of our family," Dimitri said, each word like a knife. "She's an employee, and her employment is terminated." Nico looked between his father and Sera, his young mind trying to process what was happening. "You're making her leave?" "But she promised she wouldn't go away." "She promised." "Sometimes people break their promises, Nikolai." "No!" Nico ran to Sera, wrapping his small arms around her waist. "Don't leave me. Please don't leave me. I'll be good, I'll be better, I'll—" "Oh, sweetheart," Sera whispered, kneeling down to his level. "This isn't about you being good. You're perfect exactly as you are." "Then why are you leaving?" Sera looked up at Dimitri, seeing the pain in his eyes even as his face remained stone. She could fight this. She could demand proof, could insist on her innocence, could force him to see reason. But Nico was watching, and whatever happened next would shape how this little boy saw the world. "Sometimes," she signed to Nico, her hands steady even as her heart shattered, "grown-ups have to make hard choices to keep the people they love safe." "But I love you," Nico signed, tears streaming down his face. "And Papa loves you too. I can tell." Sera's eyes met Dimitri's over Nico's head. For just a moment, she saw the man she'd fallen in love with, the father who read whale books to understand his son, the man who'd held her hand in the aquarium, the person who'd trusted her with his most precious treasure. Then the mask slammed back into place. "Goodbye, Nikolai," she said, pressing a kiss to the top of his head. "Remember what I taught you about whale songs. No matter how far apart they never stop calling to each other." She stood and walked toward the door, each step feeling like she was tearing away a piece of her soul. Behind her, she could hear Nico's broken sobs, could hear him calling her name in the language they'd shared. At the doorway, she turned back one last time. "For what it's worth," she said to Dimitri, "I love you both. That was never a lie." Then she walked out of the Volkov house and into the pre-dawn darkness, leaving behind the only family she'd ever truly belonged to. Have you ever had to walk away from something you loved to protect it? Sometimes the most devastating betrayals come not from our enemies, but from the people we trust most to see our hearts clearly. As the car pulled away from the estate, Sera pressed her face against the window, watching the lights of the house disappear into the distance. Somewhere in that beautiful prison, a little boy was learning that promises could be broken and love could be conditional. And somewhere in that same house, a man was convincing himself that pushing away love was the same thing as protecting it. The whale songs, it seemed, had fallen silent. 3 days passed in a haze of silence that felt like drowning. Sera's apartment, which had once been a refuge, now felt like a tomb. She moved through the motions of living, showering, eating, sleeping, but everything felt hollow, as if she were watching someone else's life from a great distance. Dr. Marchetti called twice. Sera let it go to voicemail both times. On the 4th day, Elena appeared at her door. The older woman looked like she'd aged years in the span of days. Her usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, her eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion and grief. "May I come in?" Elena asked quietly. Sera stepped aside wordlessly, leading Elena to her small living room. They sat in silence for a long moment before Elena spoke. "He hasn't eaten in 3 days." Sera's heart clenched, but she forced her voice to remain steady. "Dimitri." "Nikolai." Elena's voice broke on the name. "He sits in the library, in the same spot where you used to read together. He won't sign to anyone. He won't even look at his father." The image of Nico retreating back into his silence was like a physical blow. Elena, I can't. I know what Mr. Volkov told you. I know what he believes. Elena leaned forward, her eyes intense. But I also know the truth. Sera looked up sharply. What truth? The photographs were real. Someone has been watching you. But not for the reasons Mr. Volkov thinks. Elena pulled out a tablet, swiping to a series of documents. I've been doing my own investigation. The man in the coffee shop photo? Marcus Torino. Dimitri said he worked for his rivals. He does. But he wasn't meeting with you. Elena turned the tablet towards Sera. He was following you. The timestamp on that photo shows him arriving at the coffee shop 20 minutes after you left. He was tracking your movements, not collaborating with you. Sera stared at the screen, her mind racing. Then why? Because someone wanted Mr. Volkov to think you were a threat. Someone wanted to destroy the relationship between you and his family. Elena's voice grew harder. Someone who knew that the fastest way to hurt Dimitri Volkov was to take away the first happiness he'd found since his wife died. Who would do that? Someone who's been watching this family for years, waiting for the right moment to strike. Someone who knew that Mr. Volkov's greatest strength, his love for his son, could also be his greatest vulnerability if manipulated correctly. Elena swiped to another document, this one showing financial records. The photographer who took those surveillance photos? He was paid by a shell company that traces back to the Torino family. They've been planning this for months, waiting for the right opportunity. But how did they know I would approach Nico that night? They didn't. But they were ready for any opportunity. When you showed kindness to Nikolai, when you became important to both him and his father, they saw their chance. They manufactured evidence to make it look like you were working for them all along. Sera felt sick. So Dimitri was right to be suspicious. No, Elena said firmly. He was right to be protective. But he was wrong about you. And now. She gestured helplessly. Now that little boy thinks love is something that can be taken away without warning. He thinks his father chose fear over family again. What do you want me to do, Elena? Dimitri made his choice. He doesn't trust me. He's terrified, Elena corrected. There's a difference. Mr. Volkov has spent 3 years building walls to protect his son, and in one night, he thought those walls had been breached by the one person he'd allowed inside. Elena stood up, moving to the window that overlooked the city. Do you know what he did after you left? Sera shook her head, not trusting her voice. He went to his office and destroyed everything. Every piece of furniture, every file, every reminder of the empire he's built. Victor found him sitting in the wreckage at dawn, holding a picture of Katerina and crying like a broken man. The image made Sera's chest tight. Elena! He knows he made a mistake. But he's Dimitri Volkov. He doesn't know how to admit he was wrong without appearing weak. And in his world, weakness gets people killed. So what are you asking me to do? Elena turned back to her, and Sera saw something fierce and determined in the older woman's eyes. I'm asking you to fight for them. Both of them. Because right now, they're both drowning, and you're the only one who knows how to throw them a lifeline. He told me never to come back. He told you that because he was scared and hurt and lashing out at the person who'd become most important to him. Elena's voice softened. Sera, I've worked for this family for 15 years. I watched Katerina fall in love with a man who thought he was too dangerous to deserve happiness. I watched her teach him that love isn't about being safe, it's about being brave enough to be vulnerable with someone. Elena moved closer, her eyes intense. Katerina would have fought for her family. She would have walked through fire to bring them back together. And right now, that's what Nikolai needs. That's what they both need. Sera thought about Nico's face when she'd left, about the way his small hands had formed the sign for "don't go" over and over. She thought about Dimitri's eyes in that last moment, the pain he'd tried so hard to hide behind anger. What if he won't listen? What if he really believes I betrayed them? Then you make him listen. You show him the evidence. You remind him who you really are. Elena's voice grew stronger. You remind him that some things are worth fighting for, even when the fight seems impossible. Sera was quiet for a long moment, weighing the risks against the potential rewards. Going back meant facing Dimitri's anger again, meant possibly making things worse for Nico, meant opening herself up to more heartbreak. But it also meant the chance to heal what had been broken. The chance to show a little boy that love didn't always disappear when things got difficult. The chance to prove that some promises were worth keeping, even when keeping them required more courage than she knew she possessed. The evidence you found, Sera said finally. Can you prove it conclusively? I can prove that you were set up. I can prove that the Torino family orchestrated this whole thing. I can prove that you're innocent of everything Mr. Volkov accused you of. And Nico? How is he really? Elena's face crumpled slightly. He's lost, Sera. He keeps asking Elena why his papa sent away the person who taught him that he was worth loving. He thinks it's his fault somehow, that if he'd been a better son, you would have stayed. That decided it. Sera couldn't let Nico blame himself for the adult's failures. She couldn't let him retreat back into the silence that had nearly consumed him before. Okay, she said, standing up with new resolve. What do we do? Elena smiled for the first time since she'd arrived. We remind Dimitri Volkov that the most dangerous thing he can do isn't letting people close. It's pushing away the people who love him most. Have you ever had to choose between protecting yourself and fighting for someone you love? Sometimes the greatest act of courage is refusing to give up on people who have given up on themselves. As they began to plan, Sera felt something she hadn't experienced in days: hope. It was fragile and uncertain, but it was real. And maybe, just maybe, it would be enough to bring a family back together. After all, whale songs could travel across entire oceans. Surely love could cross the distance between two broken hearts. The question was whether Dimitri would be brave enough to listen when she started singing.